Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Gus. Ross, good to hear from you. I've seen you move into the distance, and Cedric as well. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk a bit about, as you can see from the title, supporting industry to reduce emissions, which is one of ARENA's key priority areas, and talk about the challenges and opportunities in the space. Perhaps I'll just start out by saying that the key points that we'd like to express, or I'd like to express with you today, is that industry is vital to the overall emissions reduction challenge. As we'll see, and as we know, it's easier to transition to renewables in the other sectors. Industry will ultimately be the remainder. That will be a growing share of the remaining emissions, and so we ought to think ahead of time, as we're doing with our response to the virus. We will be thinking ahead of time over a period of decades as to something that could be equally as challenging in the long term. There's also risks and great opportunities for Australia, and I think that's an important part of the equation. And we're not without technology solutions. So we have many solutions available to us today. Many of those are more mature and can be implemented in the short term, but many are longer term and require research and development and many different approaches before we can take them up. I'll talk a bit about how ARENA is helping, and ultimately what the benefits are if we can be successful in helping industry transition to renewable energy solutions and low emission solutions. Just a little bit about ARENA to get started. Many of you know this already. We've been active in the Australian market for the past 8 years. We're a federal government granting body. So most of what we do is provide financial assistance by the way of grants. We've had many successes, but we're not afraid to back new technologies. And as you can see across the top there, we've been involved in wind energy, geothermal, bioenergy, hybrid, solar, not so much wind because it was commercial early on, but some of those technology sets have succeeded already. Some are more challenged, but ARENA's role is to sponsor innovation throughout the innovation chain, and we're always willing to take technology risk in looking for innovative solutions that can help into the long term. It's not just about our money. In the bottom right-hand part of that box, it speaks to some of our very crucial knowledge sharing and collaborative functions. We bring industry together. We bring different bodies in the energy market together. For example, the way we've integrated ourselves into the other energy bodies in the Distributed Energy Integration Program, very successfully bringing collaboration and knowledge sharing together in the distributed energy space. We hope to do something similar in hydrogen, for example, and perhaps something in the industry sector later on. As of today, we have invested almost 1.5. Sorry, Ross is going to take his computer. That's great. As of today, we've invested $1.5 billion of our $2.1 billion mandate, and we have a number of things in progress which have not been invested yet, but we effectively have just under $200 million of our funding remaining to commit to new projects. And given our current business development pathway and run rate, those remaining funds will be fully committed by the end of this calendar year. So clearly, those of you who are aware of ARENA and have found ARENA useful and intend to continue to approach ARENA for support, that's something important to bear in mind, that as things currently stand, we have the remainder of this year only for future business development activities. I'd like to just talk briefly about just how we have invested funding through the innovation chain. So this slide speaks to that we've invested almost $400 million in research and development and studies, almost $600 million in pilots and demonstrations, and then about $500 million in deployment. So it's going from left to right, the very early stages, coming out of the lab, assisting researchers with financial support, and then ultimately studies into larger scale projects, then through to pilots. And then later stage deployment will be where we provide a very small percentage of the capital stack that helps that technology get to commerciality. And I think that's important for industry in that it's not just about the very early stage research and development, it's also just about known technologies that just need a little bit more financial support from government to get over the line, to get to commerciality, where the commercial market then steps in and takes over. And we've proved the success of that model through large-scale solar, where we financed $92 million towards a reverse auction round, where we had 12 large-scale solar farms get financed, and now they're all built and operating, but we've stepped away from that space. The large-scale solar space does not need government support anymore.
Darren, excuse me, do you mind, can I just interrupt you for a second? Would you mind maximising your screen? We can see your speaker notes alongside the graphs, which means we can't read the graphs.
I'm sorry.
That's all right, thank you. Better? Well done, thanks.
Okay. As you can tell, my speaker notes are very different to what's actually on screen. So I'll move on and talk about industry now. And in a sense, industry is up to almost half of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And if it's not traditional to look at it this way, but effectively industry uses electricity. It's a user of transport, so it intersects with the transport, what's traditionally called the transport sector. And then the core industry sector, representing 20% of direct emissions, is the process heat element of industry. But if we can engage successfully with industry, and part of it is philosophical or psychological for industry to get on board and start to move towards renewable solutions, then industry will take up electrification options, industry will take up renewable options for transport as well as process heat. So once you've got buy-in at the boardroom level, we actually think that this kind of analysis indicates that we can have a much bigger share and much bigger bang for our buck in industry than almost any other part of the Australian economy, that we can address up to half of the emissions that are currently in the Australian economy through successful engagement with industry. In terms of the more direct emissions, process heat, high temp and low temp, industry accounts for 20% of emissions. And in terms of fugitives from fossil fuels, that's 10%. And that's pretty important to understand where we direct our attention going forward. And as I'll just drill down into this next slide, we've sort of broken up the direct emissions from industry and said, where do those come from? And if you look across the left-hand side, those light teal and the green bars, almost 50% of industry's direct emissions are associated with oil and gas extraction and fossil fuel extraction. And so this leads you to the thought of, and I don't have an answer for this, it's just a question, is it worth directing a lot of attention towards CCS or dealing with fugitive emissions from fossil fuel extraction and processing? Or do we accept that those things will go away over time through intention of Australia or through just sheer movement in the global economy? And therefore, our proper attention should be towards things on the right-hand side, where even once we've removed fossil fuels from the mix, we will still have to deal with other kinds of mining, metal production, construction, cement, and manufacturing. Those are the smaller shares, but ultimately will become, in theory, the larger shares as we move away from fossil fuels from other sectors of the economy, which will have these flow-on benefits, if you like, to the industrial emissions issue. So really, that's more of a question than a conclusion, but I think it's worth debating and understanding how much effort to direct towards those left-hand side activities. Cedric will be well aware of this. In fact, you probably drew it, but just pointing out that as you move towards 2050, firstly, we have a problem in that we have not achieved on this analysis, on this forecast, net zero position. And the key issues being transport and industry under this analysis have not decarbonised to the same extent as the power industry, which we know is the furthest along, the easiest and the cheapest sector of the economy to decarbonise, along with forestry and agriculture providing potentially negative emissions. So again, just the scale of the challenge being we need to focus on industry, we need to focus on transport in order to get to net zero in any sensible time frame to achieve 2 degrees, or ideally 1.5. This is a analysis adapted from McKinsey, where we look at the key industrial processes along the left-hand side of the y-axis and the key solutions along the x-axis. And it speaks to what stands out from this analysis is that bioenergy, biofuel as a feedstock is much more advanced than these other solutions, but we know we have scale challenges with biomass that need to be addressed in another way. So hydrogen, electrification, CST, and CCS, where we have a high concentrated and high pressure source of carbon, could be solutions for industrial decarbonisation. In terms of what's driving all of this, I think we know, and increasingly I think the thing that I've noticed over the last 12 months is just heavy industry, mining producers leading the charge now into low emissions technology. And there's many reasons why that might be, but clearly global supply chains are moving in this direction, shareholders are moving in this direction, customers are moving in this direction, and these very large mining companies and fossil producers are responding to that. So we have both now demand pull as well as supply push happening. And Australia is very well positioned, as Ross has explained quite thoroughly in his talk and through his book, and many others have, that Australia is very well positioned in terms of its resource capacity, both in terms of minerals as well as renewable energy to succeed in this new environment. I won't talk to the slide, other than to say, I think the things on the left-hand side, the bullet points to the bottom, are very important as well. Why should Australia succeed in this new world? It's about our trusted relationship with other economies that makes us, in a sense, uniquely positioned to profit from the transition to renewable energy. Other countries have wind and solar in abundance, in negative or no correlation to each other. So Chile, South Africa, Morocco, other parts of the Middle East have those resources, but Australia has demonstrated success with other countries in setting up trading relationships, in our engineering capabilities, in our project finance abilities. And it's the combination of all of these things that are important, and we ought to address them all and stay on top of all of them as we transition and try and succeed from an export perspective. Just in terms of ARENA, we set ourselves 3 priorities, which we communicated very clearly to the market in September last year. Firstly, integrating renewables into the electricity system. We still see it as our job to ensure that the transition in the electricity system is as smooth and optimized as possible. And we're doing a lot of work still in that area, which I'll talk to very briefly. We've set ourselves a priority around hydrogen, and that's not just about the export of the molecule, it's about the production of hydrogen at scale in Australia, with various end users in mind in the next decade, with an eventual export opportunity at the end of that if we can successfully reduce the cost of producing, storing, and working with hydrogen in the domestic economy. And finally, our third priority, and perhaps the hardest and the one most relevant to today, is supporting industry to reduce emissions, and we'll talk a bit about our work in that space. I won't spend much time on priority 1. Suffice to say, we've been involved in all facets of the electricity system, through security and reliability at the large scale, through to distributed energy, electric vehicles, and our ongoing financing and leadership in the solar PV R&D space, which we see as crucial to getting costs of modules and ultimately the levelized cost of energy of solar PV in particular down to extremely low levels over time. That is a crucial element in being able to move industry and other sectors to renewable energy. You need to capture that energy from the sun in the first place before you can do anything with it. Accelerating the use of renewable hydrogen, as I said, looking primarily at the domestic opportunity and ultimately the export opportunity once we've got that underway. The sector's in its infancy, and we think large amounts of government support are still going to be needed to get that industry to commerciality. And just to talk to that idea, this is a stylized chart that we've used and reflects our experience in large-scale solar, where to the left-hand side, you start out with very small demonstration projects, and ARENA has funded I think 3 or 4 now pilot and demonstration projects in the hundreds of kilowatt capacity. We're now moving into the small megawatt capacity, but importantly looking at moving into the at scaling that up by 10 times into the 10 megawatt and above capacity. So we have right now scoping out a hydrogen funding round for deployment of larger scale electrolyzers. We are likely to commit $70 million to a number of projects, hopefully more than one, but ideally 2 or 3 projects to build 10 megawatt and above electrolysis facilities. We are agnostic about what that end use is. The commercial market will tell us what the best use cases are for electrolyzed hydrogen. In the first instance, it could be remote area power, it could be ammonia, it could be transport into another industrial facility, or grid injection into the gas networks. So that is currently where we sit right now in that sort of 2020 timeframe. But ultimately, we hope to scale that into hundreds of megawatts and ultimately gigawatt scale facilities towards this latter half of this decade. And the dotted line is a stylized indication of the fact that government support will continue to be needed to scale this industry, but will become a reducing share of the total capital value over time as the commercial market sees the cost reductions and jumps in. I've talked a little bit about the hydrogen round. Many of you would have been to one of our consultation sessions. We've held them throughout capital cities in Australia. We're busy collecting all that information and ultimately taking that to our board in a couple of weeks for decision. If all goes well, we'll be announcing the round and the parameters of the round and asking for expressions of interest in around the April timeframe. So any of you who are not aware or have not been involved in consultation on that program, please have a look at our website or call our team and we'd be happy to arrange a briefing for you. In terms of supporting industry to reduce emissions, this is the most recent priority for ARENA. We've been doing electricity system for a while and even hydrogen for a couple of years. Over the past 9 months, we've been focusing on industry and how can we help industry to reduce emissions. We've been funding the ASTRI program for high temperature solar thermal for a number of years now. We've committed just under $50 million to that program, and that'll be a multi-year program that is rolling out right now and doing good work. We've provided $1 million in finance to A2EP, the Australian Alliance for Energy Productivity, looking at low temperature applications in over 20 different industrial facilities. And recently we funded, and Keith Lovegrove will talk to the Renewable Energy Options for Process Heat report that we put out, and ITP was involved in preparing that report and doing all the work. So we'll hear more about that. And otherwise, we're directly engaged with large industrials currently. I can't talk about the specific names, but you can imagine the kinds of large industrial companies that we're engaged with, looking at those harder to abate, but very important industrial processes, and how can we support early stage demonstrations or ultimately even greenfields projects eventually for processing of minerals that we have in abundance in Australia. So I haven't kept my eye on the time, Susan, but I'm happy to take questions. Just in conclusion, as I set out, industry is vital to the emissions reduction challenge. 20% of direct emissions, but up to 50% of total emissions when you look at transport and electricity too. There's various risks, but ultimately great opportunities for Australia. We've heard that from others. We know that there's certain technology solutions that exist today, and our job is to, on the right-hand side of the innovation chain, get those to commerciality, but also to keep funding research and development for those longer term, more harder to abate sectors. And ultimately, if we succeed, I think this will be of great benefit to Australia. We will be able to reduce our exposure from the industrial perspective to fossil energy price volatility. We've already heard from Ross that renewable energy is all about capital, not operating. And so this could provide great certainty to industry once you've made that commitment. We get to access new markets. New markets are evolving and developing all the time. This is not just about what we lose, it's also about what we could gain by being an innovator and obviously accelerating Australia's emissions reduction ambitions. The, in inverted commas, meeting and beating our targets is a key element of why the government is supportive of ARENA, the CFC and other bodies. And we hope to continue to do our good work for a long time to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Darren. Do we have a question of Darren? We've probably got time for one quick question. We have no questions. Rob.
Hi, Rob Dickinson, CET. A difficult question. What's the chances of, for Darren, of course, the government reversing its decision to cut funding? Like, it's obvious that we need hydrogen for a decade, and yet ARENA's being cut by the end of the year.
So I think I got most of that. Firstly, there's no reversing of its decision. The government set up ARENA 8 years ago. It always had a 10-year life. So really, it's reaching the end of its original intention. I think many people would say we've done a great job. We ought to stick around for the longer term, and certainly there's a lot more work to do. I think the government is very supportive of ARENA's role. The Minister has said that publicly, but clearly our funding needs to be resolved, and the government, as I understand, is looking at that. But I have no information I can provide you at this point, but clearly it's an important thing for the industry and for ARENA to understand whether we have a future beyond the end of this year.
Mike, you have a question?
Yes, actually, Mike Young, for all speakers. I sense that Australia's been talking a lot about hydrogen for exports. What I hear from all of the speakers today is the pathway will not be through exporting hydrogen, but largely through using it locally here. I wonder if I'm right in picking that shift in thinking.
I think you're right. For myself, I think hydrogen is difficult to travel. I think the Japanese cross-ministerial SIP program has looked at how to put that in carriers and then extract hydrogen at the other end. But finally, I believe more that you will use hydrogen to make a number of things that will be rich in hydrogen content. Some be used as fuels, some as feedstocks, and they will be exported because, for example, if you need a product that is easy to put aboard a ship or a plane, and therefore it needs to have some qualities that make also these products easy to put on a ship to travel from Australia to anywhere where the ship or planes could be refueled. And therefore, I believe there is a unity between the characteristics of this product in the fact that it's easy to ship and to export, and that it's then easy to use at the other end. While with hydrogen, it's very much more difficult. And if you have too many transformation, getting in ammonia and out of ammonia, getting in methanol and out of methanol, etc., well, it will have more difficulties to compete with hydrogen produced in another country, even if the renewable resources in that other countries are not as good as the ones you have in Australia.